I went to a conference recently where the opening speaker said there's only one thing worse than speaking after lunch, and that's doing the opening presentation. So that's both of these here now, and it's the Carey conference, and it's a paper on Carey. So it's all just piling up. Anyway, I want to start by taking you on a little trip to a village called Paulusperry. Anyone heard of that? Yeah, one or two. Now, this village is as obscure now as it was in 1761, although there's a lot more money around, and it has a website now. But Paulusperry is significant for one reason. This is where William Carey was born, 250 years ago this August, just over 80 miles from where we sit now. Carey lived through an era of revolution. These were the days of the Boston Tea Party and the French Revolution, and he himself was to inspire a revolution, a revolutionary paradigm shift in world missions. And from such unpromising beginnings, Carey was a short, bald man from the Midlands. That may be an encouragement to someone here. As a child, he developed allergies and a skin disease that gave him a painful rash when he was in the sun too long. Hardly a promising start for a life of missionary service in India. His formal education ceased at the age of 12, which he was to rue in later life. And his trial sermon at the church in Olney hardly set the world on fire. The church minute book reads, W. Carey, in consequence of a request from the church, preached this evening. After which it was resolved that he should engage again on a suitable occasion for some time before us, in order that further trial may be made of his ministerial gifts. Well, they weren't too sure. In the end, he won them over. Carey was dirt poor, and he pursued his trade as a shoemaker whilst a pastor, often to support his large family. And his ministerial circles were rather unimpressive. The Northamptonshire Association was a far cry from the centres of Baptist power in London. Carey's colleagues came from places like Thrapston, Arnsby and Rode. Some of them were leading churches of fewer than 25 people. Yet this group of country Baptists founded the world's first Protestant missionary society. The decision was taken by 14 men, crammed into a back parlour, a lean-to parlour measuring 12 foot by 10. Their start-up fund was collected in a snuff tin and amounted to £13, 2 shillings 6d. Some in promises, not hard cash. Timothy George summarises Carey's credentials upon his arrival in India. Education, minimal. Degrees, none. Savings, depleted. Political influence, nil. References, a band of country preachers half a world away. What are his resources? A weapon, love. A desire to bring the light of God into the darkness. A strategy to proclaim by life, lips and letters the unsearchable riches of Christ. And what were the results of Carey's mission? Vishal and Ruth Mangalwadi imagined a quizmaster at the All India Universities competition posing the question, who was William Carey? All the hands go up. But various answers are proposed. First student says he was a botanist, after whom the Eucalyptus Carya herbacea is named. He brought the English daisy to India and introduced the Linnaean system to gardening. He published the first books on science and natural history in India. He founded the Agri-Horticultural Society in the 1820s, campaigned for agriculture reform. A second student jumps in. No, William Carey introduced the steam engine to India. He was the first to make indigenous paper. He encouraged Indian blacksmiths to make copies of his engine using local materials. He brought the modern science of printing and publishing and built the largest press in India. Someone calls out, he established the first newspaper ever printed in an Oriental language. His journal, The Friend of India, paved the way to the social reform movement in India in the first half of the 19th century. A fourth person points out that William Carey was the first to campaign for the humane treatment of India's leprosy patients. He also crusaded for women's rights, conducting research and publishing reports that helped to influence the British government to ban sati, the practice of burning widows alive on their dead husband's funeral pyre. The answers keep coming. Forest conservationist, public servant, moral reformer, professor of Oriental languages, founder of schools, in short, an agent of cultural transformation. The Mangalwadis go so far as to call him the central character in the story of India's modernisation. All of that, and apparently he was a really nice bloke. And we haven't even mentioned Carey's main achievements, which were in the realm of linguistics and Bible translation. He made or oversaw translations of the entire Bible into 6 languages, and parts of it into 29 more. He was also responsible for publishing grammars in 7 Indian languages and the compilation of 3 dictionaries. Brian Stanley concludes, these would have been signal achievements for a scholar with formal linguistic training. For someone whose formal education had finished at the age of 12, they must be judged extraordinary. Welcome if you've just come in. Extraordinary is the word. Indeed, it's hard to believe that all these things could be true of just one man. Recent scholars have tended to emphasise the role of Carey's colleagues, particularly William Ward and Joshua Marshman. They were known as the Serampore Trio. Not to mention Hannah Marshman, Joshua's wife, and the myriad support staff who were vital to Carey's survival and success. Let's be real. Carey was extremely dependent on others. Without them, he probably would have been a footnote. So we need to be aware of the strong tendency to mythologise Carey, to overstate his achievements and gloss over his flaws. Much work remains to be done to give us an authoritative, modern, critical account of Carey's life and legacy. This project is long overdue. It's been several decades since the last major biography of Carey. In some respects, he remains an enigma. So if there's a historian here with a spare 10 years, maybe you think about it. Nevertheless, even the most sober assessment of the Bengal mission must admit its extraordinary impact. What lessons can we draw from this story today? I'd like to draw your attention to 3 aspects of William Carey. And I've used 3 alliterative headings, because after all, this is a Baptist conference. Now, I couldn't get 3 P's, so I've got 3 M's. The man, the missionary, and the model. But before we go any further, respect to Carey requires that we pause and just listen to his voice. I think I can almost hear it, barely more than a whisper. The great man, I suspect, would have been mortified to learn that there was a conference named after him, or that we were celebrating his legacy today. When told of William Wilberforce's high commendation of him in the House of Commons, Carey said, "I wish people would let me die before they praise me." He learned that people in England were beginning to collect crockery and other relics from his early life. His response, "The less said about me, the better." He chided John Sutcliffe for publishing extracts from his letters that, quote, "savoured strongly of vanity, and which, when they have been printed, have made me wish they had never been written." Most striking were his words to Alexander Duff, Scottish missionary, who visited Carey during his final illness. Here's a quote from Duff's biographer. On one of the last occasions on which Duff saw him, if not the very last, he spent some time talking chiefly about Carey's missionary life, till at length the dying man whispered, "Pray." Duff knelt down and prayed and then said goodbye. As he passed from the room, he thought he heard a feeble voice pronouncing his name, and turning, found that he was recalled. He stepped back accordingly, and this is what he heard, spoken with a gracious solemnity. "Mr. Duff, you have been speaking about Dr. Carey, Dr. Carey. When I am gone, say nothing about Dr. Carey. Speak about Dr. Carey's Saviour." Duff went away rebuked and awed, with a lesson in his heart that he never forgot. So Carey himself issues us with a caveat today to ensure that the real hero of this story is the Lord Jesus Christ. So we'll think firstly of Carey as a man, a complex, flawed, multi-layered human being, before turning to his significance as a missionary and a model in a couple of parting shots about contemporary relevance. Carey, the man. So who was William Carey? Now, in seeking to get beyond the legend to the historical Carey, we immediately encounter the problem of sources. Recent biographies have often simply relied on the old stuff, and the old stuff tended towards hagiography. Another problem for students of Carey is that his literary output is mostly in the form of letters, and he had terrible handwriting. And these, in many cases, haven't been published in their entirety. Carey confessed to an aversion to writing. He only kept a journal for the first 2 years in India. After that, he got rather busy. And apart from grammars and dictionaries and translations, the only book he ever published as such was The Inquiry, which came very early in his career. Nevertheless, I think by searching through it, I've been able to kind of get a sense of Carey and find one or two intriguing insights, some of which stopped me in my tracks when I read them. First thing to note about Carey is his incredible focus. He had an ability to devote himself utterly to whatever task was in hand. This emerged early in his life, and it goes some way to explaining his ability with languages. At the age of 12, he taught himself Latin by studying an old textbook. Whilst working as a shoemaker, he proceeded to teach himself New Testament Greek, Biblical Hebrew, French, and Dutch. He believed that any language in the world could be mastered in 1 or at the most 2 years. He also focused his attention on the natural world, with a particular fondness for horticulture. Again, Carey's ability to focus on the details, to observe and record absolutely everything, ensured that his passion for gardening exceeded the boundaries of any normal hobby. Wherever he went, Carey would turn a bit of land into an earthly paradise. In fact, the garden that he created in Serampore was a botanical park that was unique in southern Asia for more than half a century. That was his hobby. Carey's focus can also be seen in his pursuit of the concept of global missions. Now, like many people of his day, Carey's imagination was captured by the descriptions of Captain Cook's South Sea voyages, and he read them, devoured them. Unlike most people, Carey proceeded to devote himself to researching what the world was really like. He's constantly scavenging around for scraps of information about other countries. He compiled this sort of dossier of information. He's fascinated with the population, their history, geography, above all religion. And in discovering the wonders of the wide world, as reported by Captain Cook, Carey also woke up to the state of people living outside of Christ. And this lit a fire in him that was never to go out. He made a big map, and he added factual information to it all the time. And this later formed part of the evidence base for his argument for world evangelization. Focus. Now, Carey's genius, I think, lay in the combination of this focus with another quality: tenacity. Carey simply never gave up. He famously said to his nephew, "Eustace, if after my removal anyone should think it worth his while to write my life, I will give you a criterion by which you may judge of its correctness. If he give me credit for being a plodder, he will describe me justly. Anything beyond this will be too much. I can plod. I can persevere in any definite pursuit. To this I owe everything." Now, those words are very revealing. Carey was indeed exemplary in his perseverance, his ability to stick to the task and keep at it. That explains much of his success. At the same time, with respect to Carey and respect to the fact this is a second-hand quote, there is something slightly self-absorbed about those words. Carey did not owe everything simply to his ability to plod. He owed just as much to the people around him, the people who made his sedentary life of study and meticulous work possible, the people who freed him from virtually all domestic concerns, including parental ones. And this is where Carey's remarkable strengths turn out to have a downside. His focus, his tenacity, inadvertently led him to overlook the needs of his first wife, Dorothy. 5 years his senior, Dorothy was an uneducated woman from a close-knit village family. She'd never left the Midlands before, let alone travel to India. She didn't want to go. She wasn't brought into the process when William made his dramatic offer to go to India with John Thomas. She was running a household on a budget and looking after 3 young sons and heavily pregnant. She refused to go to India. William decided to go anyway. Now, what exactly passed between them, we will never know. They agreed, eventually, that William could take the first son, Felix, who was then about 8 years old, on the 5-month sea voyage to keep him company. Dorothy relocated with the other children to live near family in the village of Piddington. It appears that the plan was for William to get established in the mission and come back in 3 or 4 years' time for her. In the event, the sea voyage was postponed because of problems created by the East India Company. It looked like the great dream was over before it even started. But this was a surprising providence. John Thomas managed to secure passage on another ship, this time Danish, and he and Carey were able to take one last trip back to the Midlands to see the newborn baby, Jabez. The silver-tongued Thomas, who was always as much of a liability as he was an asset to Carey, managed to persuade Dorothy to come with less than a day to go. So they packed up and went. Dorothy had named Jabez herself, probably recalling 1 Chronicles 4. His mother called his name Jabez, saying, "Because I bear him with sorrow." But this was not to be the end of her sorrow. The stresses and strains of the early years in India, living in abject poverty, moving every few months, suffering from dysentery, alienation and foreign climate, finally the death of their son Peter from illness at the age of 5, all these factors ruined her mental health. She was fragile in the first place. She became obsessively jealous of Carey and followed him around, eventually at times trying to take his life. She held a knife to his throat. In 1801 he wrote to his sisters, "Mrs. Carey is obliged to be constantly confined. She has long got worse and worse, but fear both of my own life and hers, and the desire of the police of the place obliged me to agree to her confinement." She was locked in the bedroom. In 1805, 4 years later, "Poor Mrs. Carey is a very distressing object. Her whole life is a life of fear and rage, arising from troubles. Indeed, her insanity is of that distressing nature that she never has any of those pleasing illusions which many in that unhappy state have, but seems to be wholly under the influence of malevolent impressions, of solicitude for her children, an idea that they are ill or injured, constantly occupies her mind and fills her with almost boundless rage against the supposed enemies of her offspring." Now, after 12 years of anguished suffering, she succumbed to a fever and died in 1807. Peace at last. Joshua Marshman's son, John Clark Marshman, later made a striking observation, which I find quite haunting. He said the arduous biblical and literary labours in which Carey had been engaged since arriving at Serampore 8 years previous were prosecuted while an insane wife, frequently wrought up to a state of the most distressing excitement, was in the next room but one to his study. It is a haunting image. The scholar at work, 2 rooms away, his wife going up the wall. If ever proof was required of the need for rigorous assessment for missionary candidates and their families, Dorothy Carey is it. And the caveat, of course, applies to other forms of full-time ministry. Zeal and sense of calling have to be accompanied by a hard-headed assessment whether this person is really suited to the task we're sending them to do or not. And what about their spouse? William was eminently suitable. Dorothy was not. But by this point, Carey himself was painfully aware of this fact. As early as 1796, he wrote to Andrew Fuller outlining a vision for future mission work. He now advocated 7 or 8 missionary families living together in community. He wrote, "It is absolutely necessary for the wives of missionaries to be as hearty in the work as their husbands. As much depends on the endowments and devotedness of females as upon their husbands." It's all in the same letter. And he repeated, "Pray be very careful what stamp missionaries' wives are made of." Now, we might assume that all of this is so obvious that it hardly bears repeating, and that we've moved on since Carey's day. But ask yourself, how rigorous was the last ministry appointment you observed? Who drew up the job specification? Who outlined the criteria for candidates? Who talked to the spouse? In what contexts? How many people were involved in the process? How objective was it? Recruitment issues, even more acute when people apply for cross-cultural work, which places huge stress on the workers. How accountable are missionary candidates to their local church leadership, who know them best? How good is the communication? How honest? How committed are the agencies to assessing candidates properly at every level of life, including their family? Do they work with church leaders in the process? It seems to me that too often somebody feels called and away they go. Of course, when we mythologise heroes like Carey, we add to the problem. We should not perpetuate the impression that Christian history is written by individual heroes, great men, getting out there and doing it on their own. It seems we have a lot to learn from Dorothy. One more quality of Carey the man that merits attention, and that is his humility. I've found this startling to the point of being shocking. When writing to close friends and family about his struggles, now some of the early biographers, interestingly, kept sections of these letters out of the press. I don't know whether it was etiquette or a desire to shield people from the real Carey. But I think his words speak for themselves, and his candour about the life of faith is rare and refreshing. So I've included a couple of long quotations here. I hope you'll find them beneficial. This is what he wrote to his father while he was in his first pastorate at Moulton. "Ah, me, I am myself a scene of conflicting passions. I long to be different from my present self, am dissatisfied with myself, and feel a most amazing degree of indolence, guilt and confusion in my mind. But I have no consolation, even to make an effort to examine my heart and recollect my ways. I am unworthy to live or set on the earth, but so inadequate to the great work of the ministry that I wonder why God has not confounded me before his people before now. And oh, how dreadful it will be if, after having preached the gospel to others, I myself should be cast away. Oh, how important are the concerns of eternity. How dreadfully do I trifle away time and do nothing for God. And yet my relentless soul don't truly grieve, nor do I blush in the sight of God or man for my being a disgrace to the human species." This next quote is to his sisters, written from India in 1801. Most extraordinary paragraph. "When I speak of spiritual and eternal things, I have more reason to be humbled in the dust than any mortal being. Through very great mercy, I have hitherto been preserved from committing any such evil as would expose the cause of God to reproach. But no one can tell how near I have been to the commission of crimes which would have done it completely. I have frequently at night been very thankful to God that I have not been suffered to fall down the precipice on which I have stood. And for weeks together, every day has appeared to be a day of remarkable preservation and escape. I am in a world of temptation and have an heart capable of any crime, so that I have frequently thought that my escapes have been much more owing to the superintendence of God, who in his providence has put it out of my power to act myself out, than to any true grace which I possess, and which might be supposed to influence me to flee from the ways of sin. Indeed, I have been often so much depressed that I have concluded myself to be the real cause why this mission has not been more successful, because it would be inconsistent with the character of God to give a blessing to the labours of one who lives so distant from himself, and would appear to the world to be a sanctioning of indolence and disregard to his honour and his most holy commandments. Now, Carey was always talking about himself as indolent, and even at the age of 70, described himself as a loiterer, which is hard to put together with his weekly diary. One final quote. This is written by Carey in his mid-50s. So not words of a young Christian. This is to his only brother. As it respects my private experience, I almost always labour under doubts respecting the sincerity of my profession, and question whether one who has so little of active, positive love for God can be a true Christian. I'm always obliged to cast myself at the foot of the throne of mercy to hope for acceptance at last through the merits of my Lord Jesus Christ. In short, this is all my hope. Finally, a letter that was recently discovered in the John Rylands Library in Manchester and published last year. Now, in 1792, Carey had preached his famous sermon, became known as the Deathless Sermon, preached in Nottingham, and he gave this great clarion call: expect great things, attempt great things. Crest of the wave, everybody starts giving, go out to India. Here he is, 6 years later. My dear sister, I just snatch an hour after the family have gone to rest, and it's almost midnight, to write you a short letter, and you must be contented with the short one. For I have so much exceeded all bounds in some, which I have written, and which you will see, or the substance of them, that I have no time left, nor anything to say. No one expects me to write about experience, or any of the common topics of religion, nor to say anything about the doctrines of the gospel, but news. And continual accounts of marvellous things are expected from me. I have, however, no news to send. And as everything here is the same, no marvels. You see, Carey's pretty fed up. Everybody wants news, conversion of the heathen. There's nothing to tell. Don't you find that encouraging? Now, whilst Carey continued to hold on to the hope of a great outpouring of the Spirit on the heathen, and whilst the Lord did great things through him, the daily experience is usually one of struggle, self-doubt, and sticking at it through the daily grind of missions work. It took 7 years before the first Indian converted to Christ. Carey, the man. Second point's much quicker, by the way. Brings us to our second M, Carey, the missionary. The missionary. Now, what can we learn here? Of course, Carey's best known as a missionary. Indeed, he's often referred to as the father of modern missions, including in our brochure. But is this really true? In many respects, Carey was not the father of modern missions. He wasn't the first missionary of the modern period. He wasn't the first Protestant missionary. The Moravians got there first, and they were an inspiration to him. He wasn't even the first Baptist missionary. That honour belongs to the African-American George Leela, who had already planted a church of more than 500 members in Jamaica by the time Carey got on the boat for India. Others have pointed to Carey's contribution to India. But here again, the odds aren't good to call him the father of modern missions. The German Friedrich Schwartz had already been in India for 43 years by the time Carey arrived. Why do the Germans always get to the swimming pool first? Apologies, didn't know there were any Germans here, but there are. It's in the script. Bless you. Danish missionaries, Ziegenbalg and Plutschau, had translated the New Testament into Tamil way back in 1715, almost half a century before Carey was born. With all this evidence, how major was Carey's contribution? Well, missiologist Timothy Tennant, and my teacher, has recently argued that we need to view missions of history through the lens of kairos rather than through the lens of chronos. Great. What does it mean? A kairos moment isn't just a linear timeline. It's an undetermined period of time in which something special happens. It changes things forever. Something qualitatively different. That's what Carey provided under God. Tennant argues that the problem with Protestant missions was the absence of structure. Whereas the Roman Catholics had a long tradition of sodalities that could focus on specific needs and ministries, the Reformers hadn't carried the concept of sodalities over into their thinking. Tennant concludes, the reasons why Protestants didn't send any missionaries out for the first 200 years were not only theological, but also profoundly structural. There was no structure to do it. And this is where Carey comes in. His proposal for global missions is both theological and structural. And the fuel that propels his vision comes from fresh readings of Scripture. Carey took Jesus at his word, like those disciples long ago. The full title of his book, wait for it, is An Inquiry into the Obligations of Christians to Use Means for the Conversion of the Heathens, in which the religious state of the different nations of the world, the success of former undertakings, and the practicability of further undertakings are considered. I know, it's catchy. But really there are two key words in the title. The first is obligations, and the second is means. Obligations. Carey searched the Scriptures and provided a biblical theology of missions and a careful reading of the so-called Great Commission text in Matthew 28. Anyone who was here last year will know it's actually the second Great Commission text. If you're not sure what that's about, ask us afterward. But the Great Commission text, go into all the world and make disciples. He argued that Christians are still obligated to take the gospel across cultural boundaries. Now, this may seem blindingly obvious now, but it wasn't in the 18th century. A century that saw the publication of anti-missionary hymns, such as this verse. Go into all the world, the Lord of old did say, but now where he has planted thee, there thou shouldst stay. Shall we sing? Having demonstrated the mandate, the ongoing mandate for global evangelization and refuted arguments against it, Carey then provided practical suggestions for the best means to carry out the work. And I suspect his position as a dissenting Baptist was providential at this juncture. Maybe I'm a bit biased, but I think it was. Whereas members of a mainline denomination would tend to look to the big ecclesiastical structure for guidance, Carey didn't have anything like that to lean on. So he reaches out and grasps the most appropriate structure for missions that was available in his culture. It was the secular trading company. Here's how he puts it in the inquiry. When a trading company have obtained their charter, they usually go to its utmost limits. And their stocks, their ships, their officers and men are so chosen and regulated as to be likely to answer their purpose. He goes on to explain how commercial companies make every effort to make sure that the project succeeds. They endure hardship. They cross any boundary. They cultivate relationships. They gather information. They suffer constant anxiety about whether it's going to work out. All of that for commercial gain. Carey then takes that paradigm and he harnesses it for the gospel. Here he is again. Suppose a company of serious Christians, ministers and private persons, were to form themselves into a society and make a number of rules respecting the regulation of the plan and the persons who are to be employed as missionaries, the means of defraying the expense, etc., etc. Can you see the simple genius of this proposal? He took the concept of the trading company and applied the gospel. That's why Carey is the father of the modern missions movement, because he was the catalyst for the birth of the Mission Society. By the time of his death, there were 14 British missionary societies, besides others in continental Europe and America. Thousands of missionaries were sent out by these societies, many personally inspired by Carey's example. A new era had begun. We've thought about Carey the man and the missionary. Finally, let's turn to Carey as a model. There are so many areas in which Carey and his colleagues, the Serampore trio, as well as their supporters back in England, the Baptist Missionary Society, the BMS, so many ways that they were models. We could talk about their robust commitment to Bible translation, the conviction that God speaks through his word. We could talk about their convictions regarding the radical lostness of fallen humanity, which motivated sacrificial mission and a humble estimate of one's abilities. We could talk about those things, but I'm going to take them as givens. Time permits us to look at just two areas of Carey's legacy. So I'd like to focus on theological optimism and cultural transformation. Firstly, theological optimism. What was it that sustained Carey and his colleagues through their long and challenging service in India? They faced extraordinary obstacles: financial hardship, political instability, disease, the death of colleagues and family members, local opposition, conflict with the mission society back home, and flaky converts. It turned out to be much harder to spread the gospel in India than anyone had imagined. Yet they persevered, they faced obstacles, and they overcame. What inspired them? Now, a large part of their motivation and staying power came from a deeply optimistic theology, what Ian Murray has called the Puritan hope. They believed that the best was yet to come, that the full flowering of the gospel would come soon, in which it would be seen as a world-transforming power. Historian David Bebbington writes, the particular version of the millennial belief held in the Enlightenment era, this era, was uniformly post-millennial. The second coming of Christ would not take place until after the millennium. There would be no sharp break from preceding history. Rather, the millennium would be the result of gradual improvement, a belief that shaded into the idea of progress. Evangelicals identified the future epoch as a time of peace and glory for the church that would follow on persistent mission. Perhaps the greatest single theological influence on Carey and his colleagues was Jonathan Edwards. 40 years before, Edwards had called for a concert of united prayer, which he thought would provide the pretext for spiritual renewal and evangelism on an unprecedented scale. Reading Edwards was like fetching fire to these guys in the Northamptonshire Association. It's striking that even though Carey did not live to see massive revival and converts in India remained in the hundreds rather than the thousands, he still maintained this hope. Here he is writing to his sisters in his 70s. I expect the fulfillment of all the prophecies and promises respecting the universal establishment of a Redeemer's kingdom in the world, including the total abolishment of idolatry, Mohammedanism, infidelity, Socinianism, and all the political establishments in the world, and the abolition also of war, slavery, and oppression, and all their ramifications. It is on this ground that I pray for and expect the peace of Jerusalem, not merely the cessation of hostilities between Christians of different sects and connections, but that genuine love which the gospel requires and which the gospel is well calculated to produce. This optimistic theology provided not only the initial fuel, but also the staying power of the Bengal mission. They believed God's cause would triumph. We are not doubtful respecting the final success of the gospel in these countries. Though greatly distressed at the present occurrence, our hope is in God. Now, in case we start to conclude that optimism is only available for people who hold a post-mill view, let's place the doctrine within a wider context of God's sovereignty. Carey and his colleagues had an unshakable conviction that the work they were doing was God's work, in his world, in his way. Therefore, it must triumph. Its ultimate success was guaranteed. You see this all the time in Carey's correspondence. He's always talking about providence. He sees the hand of God in events great and small, in both positive and negative. Here's a few quotes. Dear brethren, I am, through the mercy of God, still in the land of the living, and have been led by divine providence through an amazing labyrinth of circumstances, till I am in a very unexpected manner settled in this place, and surrounded with most pleasant circumstances and flattering prospects. Mr. Udney came to visit us, not knowing that I was ill, and brought a bottle of bark with him, some medicine. This was a great providence, as I was growing worse every day. After moving, this part of the country is much more populous than Mudnabati, and as the providence of God has evidently brought us hither, I trust he will bless our labours. Another time. All I can say in this affair is that however mysterious the leadings of providence are, I have no doubt, but they are superintended by an infinitely wise God. Finally, October 31st, it pleased our wise Lord to remove our dear brother Grant from us by death after an illness of 10 days. This was a very afflicting providence to us, but no doubt it was done in infinite wisdom. Sovereignty of God. Above all, we see this theological commitment to sovereignty in Carey's reaction to the terrible fire of 1812. This fire ravaged the hall that contained their printing press. It contained many of his most precious manuscripts, 10 Bible translations, translations of the Hindu epic Ramayana, the Sanskrit dictionary, together with vast quantities of paper, equipment, fonts of oriental types and other supplies. How did Carey react? His report of this providence passed rapidly from the losses suffered to a list of 8 merciful circumstances surrounding the fire for which Carey wished to give thanks. The 8th was the fact that all the missionaries had been preserved from discouragement. These are different times. To Carey, the disaster of the fire was simply another reminder of the infinitely wise providence of God, and hence also of his promises regarding the extension of his kingdom. He wrote, with tears in his eyes, "In one short evening the labours of years are consumed. How unsearchable are the ways of God. I had lately brought some things to the utmost perfection of which they seem capable, and contemplated the missionary establishment with perhaps too much self-congratulation. The Lord has laid me low, that I may look more simply to him." They picked themselves up and got back on with the job. The translations were redone in a matter of months, and they were better for it the second time round. The second edition came out before the first, because the first had been burned. And providentially, the fire turned out to be the biggest fundraising victory of the mission's history when the word got back. They had to eventually ask people to stop sending money. Brian Stanley again. People who insisted on their ultimate insignificance in the light of the grandeur of the divine purpose possessed a unique capacity to withstand the immense pressures which were applied to the Indian mission in its early history. Do we share this same confidence about the sovereignty, wisdom and providence of God in your ministry? Or is there something a bit defeatist about our faith? Now, it's no coincidence that Carey's theological optimism is linked to an assumption of the gospel's power to transform culture and social structures. And so to this we finally turn: cultural transformation. In the early 1990s, the Council of Serampore College, is still going strong, published a collection of papers in honour of the bicentenary of Carey's arrival in India. It's titled Carey's Obligation and India's Renaissance. Much is made of Carey's impact in terms of social reform, education and broad cultural modernisation, particularly by Indian scholars. Now, some may have gone a bit too far in some of their claims, with a kind of virtuous Velcro effect, where all the good stuff ends up sticking to Carey. But nevertheless, the list is impressive. Let me just give you a few quick windows. A sample of the issues. Infanticide. Infants were sometimes sacrificed to fulfill vows taken by their mothers, more than 100 a year. They could be drowned in the holy river or left exposed to the elements. Quite early on in their time in India, Carey and his colleague were horrified to find a bag hanging from a tree full of ants that had eaten a baby that had been left in the bag. Carey protested against this to the Governor-General, Lord Wellesley, who asked him to produce a report. Infanticide was abolished in 1802, although Evangeline Raj Kumar notes that the abolition predated the production of the report. It was obviously in train already. Infanticide. Sati, the practice of burning a widow alive on the funeral pyre of her deceased husband. Again, hundreds a year. Carey witnessed the rite in 1799 and was absolutely horrified. He spoke out against it. He carried out and published research on sati at the request of the governor and fought against it for more than 20 years. The practice wasn't abolished until 30 years later, but he was still going strong. And as soon as he received the declaration on a Sunday morning, Carey delegated his sermon to someone else and sat down to translate the declaration by that evening, with the hope that lives might be saved by every minute saved. Exposure of the sick and dying. A practice known as Gat Murders took place, whereby the sick and dying were carried to the banks of holy rivers and left to die. Sometimes they were then killed as a kind of mercy killing to speed up the process. Carey protested against it in 1803 and raised its profile in his journal, Friend of India. The Serampore team on the grassroots level rescued Gat victims when they saw them, and nursed them back to health, drawing the attention of government to the practice. Treatment of lepers. Because of the belief that a violent end purifies the body and ensures transmigration to a healthy new existence, lepers were sometimes drowned or burned alive. Once again, the missionaries used their journal as protest literature to surface the issue, generate discussion, and press for change. Education. After initially founding a school for European children that functioned as a funding stream, the Serampore missionaries founded numerous schools, dozens of schools for the indigenous people. One of the main reasons was to create literacy so that people could read the Bible, but it's clear that broader humanitarian aims were also in view. Hannah Marshman, in particular, was instrumental in founding and running schools for girls, which was a radical step in the culture and contributed to the development of rights for women in India. Serampore College. The trio invested massive resources in the creation of a Christian university called Serampore College. It was, quote, for the instruction of the Asiatic Christian and other youth in Eastern literature and European sciences. Part of its mandate was to educate the next generation of missionaries and church leaders, but the education envisaged was much broader than that, covering sciences and liberal arts. Remember, Carey's a great champion, horticulture and science, as well as literature. The trio drew fire from their British supporters over the decision to open the college to non-Christian students. They believed that the whole of Indian culture would benefit from leadership with a broad education from a Christian worldview. And they believed that the Christian students would benefit from positive engagement with Muslims and Hindus and others. Translation of vernacular classics. Another decision that attracted criticism from back home was Carey's decision to translate vernacular publications such as literary, historical, and even religious works. He even worked at translating Hindu scriptures. Wasn't this just a waste of time? A distraction from the work of evangelism? Not to Carey. Human culture had value, could be reclaimed by the gospel. Studying literature and the arts were valuable ends in and of themselves. They could enhance our appreciation of God's mighty works, and the Bible could hold its own in any company. A little-known proposal by William Ward suggested that a museum be established in Calcutta to preserve the best of Hindu culture, including statues of the gods. This shows that the missionaries were far from crude iconoclasts. They were able to engage with the culture, disagree with the non-Christian worldview at the deepest levels, work to undermine it, and at the same time find some good in it and seek to respect it and preserve the best of it. One of my favourite Carey quotes is from a letter which says, "We sent to you some time ago a box full of gods and butterflies, etc." and another box containing 100 copies of the New Testament in Bengali. Gods, butterflies, and the New Testament. Now that is a revealing combination of interests. Much more could be added, but time forbids. It all begs the question, why did Carey and his colleagues get so involved with so much broad social reform and cultural engagement? How did it fit in with evangelism and Bible translation? Now, I have searched the literature for statements by Carey about his perspective on that question. How does it fit in? The problem is he didn't write about it that much. It just sort of happened. And he wasn't much given to programmatic statements of any kind after arriving in India. Even the inquiry lacks a definite statement on this question about social reform and moral cultural transformation. There doesn't seem to be a grand social vision that Carey and co. were pursuing. And much of their social work had a kind of opportunistic quality. They saw things, they responded, they tried to make a change. They weren't imposing a blueprint on Indian society. It's not that social and cultural engagement were peripheral to what they did, nor were they central. There's no conversion to a kind of social gospel over time here. Carey was preoccupied with the evils of the slave trade while he was still a young man back in England. He boycotted sugar, and whenever he prayed, he always prayed about the slaves. I think the explanation is that social action, cultural engagement are natural to Carey. There's no compartmentalisation of evangelism and social justice into tightly sealed boxes. They're integrated. I think Carey would have agreed with Abraham Kuyper's famous words. No single piece of our mental world is to be hermetically sealed off from the rest, and there is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, mine. And this integrated, holistic view of Christian engagement with culture and society has much to commend itself to us today. Now, we need to work out what it's going to look like, because caring for the poor, seeking justice, and doing good to all men looks a bit different in a welfare state with a strong voluntary sector. But let's work at recapturing this part of the biblical mandate and not let our minority status function as a deterrent. Oh, we aren't big enough to do anything like that. Look at Carey. So to conclude, the man, the missionary, and the model. Once he had got over the shock of having a conference named after him, what would Carey say if he were here today? I've got my bracelet with "What would William do" on it. No, I haven't. Now, I've made a few suggestions along the way regarding contemporary relevance. I want to finish with two parting shots. Firstly, he would say, you still have an obligation to use means to convert the heathen. The job of world evangelization isn't over. Indeed, we now have a situation where most missionaries actually go to people groups who are already reached. Carey would say, what are you doing to reach the unreached? And he would be astonished at the unreached people groups in Britain. He had to go on a 5-month sea voyage to meet some Asians. I live in a city with tens of thousands of them. Church at the end of my road isn't a church. It's a mosque. Are we reaching them? You still have an obligation to use means to convert the heathen, which of course includes most British people as well. But finally, thinking of Carey's disposition, his mildness, his kindness, I think he would end with these words: keep going. Keep going. Here's what they wrote to the supporters at the end of the first year in Serampore. And with these words I'll close. Farewell. You have all need of patience. The expense of the mission is great, and success has been long delayed, but in due season you shall reap, if you faint not. We are full of expectation. We are full of hope. Amen.